Howard. Hi, good evening, Jordan. How you doing?
Nice. It's always fun when we pre-chat and then we're like, oh, we forgot to record. And so we hit record, have to produce
Yeah,
the appropriate formalities.
absolutely. And yeah, it's yeah, as we were saying, it's certainly um, whether it's what's happening in Israel, Palestine, or whether Kosovo and what's happening there, and obviously the Ukraine-Russian crisis, and certainly things are coming to a head in some fashion. I think you quoted sort of facing our Fermi paradox. That was your
Yeah.
line, as it sort of and yeah, it seems a sort of I think in our previous talk we've talked about this kind of mutually assured destruction or mutually assured thriving fork, and it seems we are. I don't want to sound too macabre, but we're joining hands in a death dance, um, with
Mhm.
and without necessarily the wisdom to actually break break through that Fermi paradox. And I think it's going to be and in some ways, I would argue that in some ways, I think it's also very clear that the idea of us, I think crises are going to shatter Overton windows of the current perceptual norms. And
Right.
those shatterings of Overton windows will make things that are currently perceived as unperceivable, impossible, improbable, open up windows for realities that we have not imagined as well. So, in some reality, I would argue these fractures that we're seeing are also simultaneously going to be fractures in in our perceived Overton windows of the possible, and are necessary. I fucking hate that word, but they're probably necessary pathways that we're going to have to face down to actually then be able to see solutions that we couldn't even imagine. And if I was to be, I'm not sure I have the right to be provocative at all on this matter, but at all, actually, I'm not sure I have any right of any. But I sort of, I heard someone say that maybe the solution or a pathway to a solution is not a two-state solution, but actually a genuine one-state solution in Israel and Palestine, and saying actually building a deep democracy for all people, which actually unfolds the capacity of all of humanity at the site of three religions, and a new theory of governance erupting in that cauldron of disagreement.
Right.
Actually, the possibility space of actually saying the only pathway to peace is a genuine acceptance of all of humanity. That's a sort of transcendence moment that are actually in opposition to the horrors that we are facing, are also the possibilities that open up in mirrors of that darkness. And I suppose in some aspect of me sees those dimensions as well. And it's difficult to both say those words in moments like this as well, but it's also some aspect of responsibility to open up horizons that are perceived as unperceivable. Um, you know,
Yeah. So I'm seeing bookends. Way back in September 11th of 2001, or specifically September 12th, 2001. There was a moment that had the highest lived possibility of really moving forward peace on the planet. The degree to which not everyone, but a sizable fraction of everyone was feeling the hurt and oriented in a very similar direction. And I mean, I guess in some sense there won't be a history to remember it, but the degree to which we allowed ourselves to be manipulated and seduced by evil men, greedy men, or perhaps just stupid men, it's hard to know, and didn't take that path, but instead, clothed in seriousness and in vengeance, I suppose, took a path of ruination, like ruination of wealth, of life, and of our collective souls. And now I really feel the same moment is almost the bookend of that, because while I, however old I was in my early 30s, could feel and see that moment and actually even begin to visualize what it would look like for us to act on the possibility in 2001. This is a wicked problem. And the situation on the ground is not the kind of thing that we can see around the corner on. I think you point exactly right. It is, it will require transcendence. It's funny, the simple phrase, it will take a miracle. Yeah, it will take a miracle. It will require the kind of miracles that happen, that we're familiar with. They don't happen all the time, but they do. And yeah, so maybe contextualize, because I certainly, and I'm sure you and I are very similar in this. Not only do I not see this as an isolated event, I do not see it as an event that is narrowly bound to the political identities of Israel and Palestine, or Jews and Muslims. Right? As far as I'm concerned, this is a piece of a fabric that includes all of us, the whole world, and in some sense forever. Right? That I did not throw out the notion of the Fermi paradox just for fun. And I think we've talked about this in the past, that we have been moving closer and closer to a moment where all the threads that are so tightly bound, pulling on one just enough, sets off the cascade. Right? It sets off the set of cascade effects to start toppling domino after domino after domino, and the whole thing slides down. And this is the point you were making, that it may be in Israel, but it may be in Azerbaijan, right? It may be in Ukraine. It may be some weird combination, but the sort of the situation is super saturated, and it just requires the right perturbation to set everything sliding. And so it is, in fact, with mortal seriousness that I say that it will take a miracle, because that's where we are. We're in the moment where we have to actually step into the space from which the miraculous occurs. That's just kind of happens in history, right? It's just the arc of how it works. The ordinary does not lead us anywhere good. And in fact, my heart almost wanted to write out to Israel, saying, just recall the mistakes we made in 2001. And it didn't fix or solve anything. Right? We're not in a better spot now than we were then. And we could have been in a better place. And so if you allow yourself to be led by the mantle of seriousness, or simply by the heart of anger and fear, you may get a brief period of resolution, but the end's not going to be good. This is not healthy for Israel. In fact, I would be utterly unsurprised that if some of the worst scenarios play out vis-a-vis Gaza, that actually is the beginning of the end of Israel as a state. And the system dynamics are not favorable. But this is on all of us. We really are in this bizarre circumstance, as you say, that this is a question of, we actually have to innovate the new thing. It's something which is capable of transcending the mind that leads to the wicked problem to not being able to be resolved. And it is on behalf of the whole of humanity.
Absolutely. And I think your point here that these are, tectonic fracture points in a way around the world. And we have many of them, both within states, between populations, between ideologies. And as our global energy, material, nutrition economy becomes more fragile, and it becomes more taut, it becomes the foundational abundance that we've been living in becomes actually no longer abundant, as people like Nate Higgins show us. The kind of energy abundance peaked, and we're now in different scenario per unit energy, or whether it's actually food nutrition cycles as food becomes increasingly a geopolitical device, as all sorts of critical minerals start to operationalize that way, we will start to rebuild in a scenario where we don't pass the Fermi threshold. We will start to build theories of property wars in a way. These are land and resource wars that are being fought out.
Mm.
And that they are archaic in nature. And actually, they set forth with the availability of weapons of sort of the distributed production of weapons of mass destruction. We know, for example, what was it? A piece of AI technology was able to uncover something like 60 different ways, chemical weapons, in a few hours.
Mm-hmm.
We are distributing that capability for large-scale human destruction by introducing the scale of trauma. And it isn't a game theory winnable scenario. Like, that's the other problem. The pure, as you rightly say, act for retribution in any of these scenarios, and I don't really want to talk about any one of them, as the constraints become significant, as pressures become significant, we are going to see these eruptions, and tactical eruptions, pre-tactical eruptions, all these sort of things, and actually people maneuvering each other into theories of losses as well.
Oh, for sure.
And all of these scenarios are being played out. And the challenge becomes that unless we're able to transcend them, we lay out an inevitable pathway to mutually assured destruction. So your point about it requiring a miracle, quite apt. And the miracle, I think the other part that may be quite hopeful is that times of great darkness also shift the Overton window of the acceptable and the possible,
Right.
and make miracles plausible. And I think that's where I see hope. When alliances and possibilities that have not been possible suddenly become plausible. And if you and I can dream dreams, we're not special. They're there in the zeitgeist, and they can be dreamed down by other people. They are possibility spaces that are drawable. And I think that's one pathway.
So, I'm going to give an example of the category of miracle that's a bit trivial, but the point is just to kind of move it into the foreground. I was imagining, asking people to figure out how to communicate over a long distance, let's say in the late 1700s. And they're going to swarm across a wide variety of different approaches, right? They'll tie notes to birds' legs. They'll send up signals as in balloons, perhaps. Now, if somebody were to come to them and talk about using radio waves, they would simply look at them with blank eyes. Right? What are you talking about? That's nonsense, literal nonsense. And until the ability to actually conceptualize the electromagnetic field, the technology of radio was in fact miraculous, which is to say impossible, which is to say just beyond the event horizon on possibility space. But as soon as we were able to cross that event horizon, it became quite possible, right? Quite practical. And that's the idea. Right? There's a wide variety of things that are currently just beyond the event horizon on possibility space. And in fact, let me actually stoke a little bit of flame of hope. For quite some time, I have come to the conclusion that we're currently sitting in an eddy, that our ability to actually move into spaces that have been made available has been artificially held back by a wide variety of different functions. But even as long ago as the late 70s, early 80s, right? There were things that were going on where the past has been artificially capable of holding the present in its grasp. And we're very much living in a deeply undead present, one that should have passed away when I was young. And mostly only tiny, tiny slivers of the future have been able to manifest. And almost all of those have become corrupted by the past's value structures and institutional frameworks. And so, of course, that's very bad news. But the good news is that it's like a taut rubber band, that if we can simply just allow the past would just sort of unclench its death grip on the present for a moment and loosen it slightly, the amount of possibility under the curve that is actually available is potentially quite tremendous. So snapping through these miraculous phases is very much a possibility.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think this is what I meant by the crises that we are likely to visit. Let's use another crisis that is probabilistically we're facing, right? So which is we will start to lose critical glaciers around the world. We already saw glacier flood in India. If we start to lose critical glaciers in the Himalayas, we are going to lose predictable water systems for 3 billion people. So if you look at the scale of the crisis that drives, that's going to require us to reimagine the governance at the nexus of India, Pakistan, and China. Right?
Yes.
A pathway to reimagining governance. Imagine suddenly when these three nations have to think about the future from the idea of collectively governing the Himalayas. So suddenly it's a mutual necessity, not a desire. It's a mutual necessity for collective governance, because any form of regressive game theory on that would mean mutually assured destruction.
Yep.
So suddenly these crises are going to open up critical Overton windows there through crisis that would be perceived impossible, right? So no longer, and maybe the pathway would be all three nation states succeed to an autonomous Himalayan region whose purpose is to actually provide sustainable water systems to three nations. They allow for autonomous or self-sovereign region to be born, sort of a biological region. Now, imagine that would not be currently even viable as a discussion space, but through crisis, suddenly it becomes available as a concept space. So that's one dimension. And the other dimension, I totally agree with what you're saying, that actually I think it's manifest in every theory of technology, every theory of application, every technique that we built and technology that we built. We've been regressively held back by theories of capital, and it is manifest in all our techniques. And that, I think, is Moloch, or whichever greed game you want to play out, it's manifesting, it's like a DNA replicating through the system and regressively holding us back. And, we talked, I think 2-3 talks back about, how our theory of capital allocation, say, into machine learning is about building the asset of machine learning, not necessarily building the machine-human synthesis capabilities, which would be a completely different theory of asset, because the asset wouldn't be a capitalizable, divisible asset of the single computational capability of a brand. It would be a didactic asset, which is completely different. So our theories of capital are building a very particular type of extractive, and I think it is extractive. So this is a mind asset. We've gone from mining minerals to mining forests and ecological systems to mining ecological services to mining human minds. And these are mined assets. They're extractive assets. They're not symbiotic assets. They're not generative assets. They're not. And I think there's something really interesting about, and this kind of open question, whether the thing that's holding us back are theories of labor. I think if you imagine how regressive a theory of seeing humans as units of labor is, as a conceptual idea in a technological landscape where the human contribution can never be reduced to a unit of labor, because we're an embodied intelligence, which is embodied being, a being of becoming, which is a developmental being, whereas actually theories of labor predictate input, output units, employment contracts. These are whole regressive frames that are actually conceptually at odds with the science, as you rightly say, and the comprehension of humans as developmental learning, unfurling beings of becomings and interbeings. We just don't have it. And this has been, and this goes back to conversations that we've had, that I think this goes back to a 1 in a 400-year revolution of how we've imagined ourselves and imagined our relationship to the planet, and that lock-in that we've got, that conceptual lock, we haven't been able to break. And I do wonder whether actually these crisis-driven shatterings of the Overton window are going to invite a break in a way that we've never seen. And these are two, but I mean, I would argue, and I think you and I would probably agree, that we're almost certainly going to see a global financial crash. It's pretty much predictable. We're going to see a major currency go down. And if we see a major currency go down, we are going to see at this moment in time the birth of smart central bank coins, which are going to disintermediate the bank. So we're going to see a few big central banks disintermediate the bank. They're going to drive control into the economy through smart digital currencies. So we're going to see a few of those. On the shadow side, we're going to see massive use of Bitcoin and coins like that, because that's going to be a free, quasi-free currency in a kind of what I'd call the outer periphery. And then in the inner periphery economies, we're going to move towards resource-backed currencies. They could be timber, they could be aluminium, they could be gold, they could be a whole bunch of resource-backed systems that are going to create liquidity. So we're going to move, and you're going to see the shockwaves because we're so dependent on the resources. We're going to see the strategic shift in currencies driven through crisis, through a failure of a global currency, and who's going to open this up? Now, the question is, can we use that shock in a way to disrupt and create a whole new, what happens if a river becomes its own money printing bank? How do we radically shift our theory of resource? How do we radically shift our theory of monetary production from centralized systems to a whole new ecological system? And those shatterings are going to open up those windows. And the question is, do they become regressive? Which in history, by the way, in every one of these shocks, not everyone, in a vast majority of these shocks, these become what I would call disaster capital, disaster power systems, i.e. they become concentrations of power, concentrations of capital. They concentrate, but there are moments where they don't do that. And those moments are extraordinary. They're your miracle moments. They don't concentrate. And they are of history like, Denmark went bankrupt in 1813, 1815, and invested in education and human development, which set the course for a new developmental pathway. So the question for us is, in those crises, can we be prepared to fracture these windows in some form of pathway that unfurls a human capacity? And those moments are going to be precious.
Yeah. And so we can sort of even think of operating protocol. Right? We need to have like our conversations, these hyper conversations, more and more people connected to the hyper conversation, more and more people learning how to tune in and listen. And then when the kairos, right, when the moment emerges, the ability to rapidly, spontaneously form the shape of the hyper conversation into something that can move towards the highest possibility, grab as much ground as it can grab. There's so many particular skills that are associated with that. And of course, there's also the consciousness raising. The more people who are able to just realize that if we go in the traditional direction of more centralized control, that doesn't actually bias much. The Fermi paradox gets closer when that happens. And the complexity of the world cannot be governed by something that is endeavoring to run that through a centralized system. And the amount of energy, the amount of complexity that we're dealing with right now is just going to blow any centralized system up. It's like, what's the phrase? My wife makes fun of me. I say this sometimes. It's a false economy, right? You think, even if in your best intent, you think you're doing a good thing by centralizing everything through a small number of central bank digital currencies and producing a nudge infrastructure and a social currency, you are in fact not.
Exactly. And I think the necessary adjacent to radical, you're absolutely right. You and I agree that there is no centralized pathway for dealing with complexity. It's an informational It's an informational impossibility, which is why centralized communism could never work against the theory of markets, because it was a computational problem. They could never solve the computational problem of predicting complex systems centrally fast enough relative to a market. So people often talk about ideological issues. I just want to talk about the informational complexity issues. And that's why centralization can't deliver, however fast. No, and people have done calculations on the computational capacity of markets, and you start to realize there's factors like huge power in the distributed computational capacity. Now, if you add with that the second dimension, which I think is really critical, is that in that capability, what we have to also move is the developmental capacity of every agent, right? So let's imagine we've got to massively move, like we've done in, the education revolution was precursored. So the Industrial Revolution was precursored in 1750, but before that by an educational revolution. We have to talk about a human developmental revolution as a precursor for, and it's not, human, it's agent development revolution. It's every agent, human, non-human, machine systems, every agent we've got to nurture in a completely different way in order to get to that decentralization. So it's a twofold problem. It's a nurture, it's a sort of human-machine ecological nurturing problem, as well as an agency problem. And these two things have to co-locate, because we can't do it through control. And this is why the kind of strategic shift we're doing is moving from theories of control orientation, centralized control orientation, to learning developmental orientation. And that is not only for humans, it's humans, machines, ecological systems, all of these things are moving towards a human development, sort of learning development pathway, which means our theories of orchestration and coherence is no longer driven through instructability, but learnability in the system. And that is a paradigm leap. We built, and what's beautiful, and I think this is genuinely beautiful, is that we are building the learning capacity of our non-human systems, machine learning. It's not artificial intelligence, machine learning, and I think that is a paradigm leap in our theory of bureaucracy, because it's no longer about if this, then that. It's actually some form of computational learning capacity, which is a bureaucratic revolution. It's a revolution of our theory of bureaucracy, because bureaucracy moves from what I would call analog logics, simple if this, then that logics, to actually computational learning capacities. And that is part of this. This is why I think the miracle is possible. I think that's the other thing. Like, the miracle is possible because actually we've reached the moment where our machine and bureaucratic systems are able to move us in a way that we could never have moved, because our bureaucratic systems were analog, prescriptive, centralized systems, because that's what the efficiency in analog systems were driving. Now we can make agent-based, learning-orientated systems, a pluriverse of those systems that doesn't drive centralization. And this is why I think a current machine learning, which is largely centralized, largely sort of through a single agent model, is actually just a false norm. It's a kind of mirror of the, as you were rightly saying, lock into a 19th century worldview rather than actually a different developmental path. And that, I think, is where hope starts to lie. So the shattering of Overton windows, the capabilities of our bureaucratic capabilities to be learning orientated, a kind of developmental model, or human developmental model, which unleashes human capacity, which is orientated in a different way. At the nexus of that starts to build deep hope and allows us to maybe glimpse a pathway beyond that Fermi paradox.
Yeah, there's a lot in there. One of the things I was noticing was the flip. So all of these capacities are ambient. They're actually a better description of how reality really is. And we put tremendous effort in trying to treat humans as if they're not developmental, right? And therefore the reality of there having a developmental learning capacity built in becomes a problem to solve, right? How do we keep these humans from creating new pathways when we're trying to keep the system very static and not changing, so that we can manage it using our 19th and 20th century mindsets and bureaucracies? And if we just flip it, say, no, this is actually not a problem, it's the thing, right? It's the generator, it's the actual generator. How do we continuously develop everything so that every interaction is simultaneously taking maximum advantage of the learning capacity of the individuals and agents and meta agents that are involved in them, as well as furthers them, right? So every interaction is a learning interaction. And it's funny, the mental model is, hold on. Can you hear the ding in the background? No, okay, then I'll ignore it. Where was I?
The learning model.
Yeah, the learning model is just recognizing that, if I create a simple model where I'm moving something back and forth, and then I have an entropic characteristic, right? Every transfer back and forth is costing me some form of energy. But if I have a developmental framework where every interaction back and forth actually increases the value of what's going on either side, which is what happens in every human interaction, right? When I'm talking to you, I'm growing, you're growing, right? We are growing. And that creates, so it's not entropic, right? We're not locked into a thermodynamic collapse. We're actually in a completely different syntropic domain. That's the key, right? That's the key to the whole thing.
That's the point, right? So we're locked into understanding the world through a thermodynamic relay, as opposed to actually as a developmental, as an entropic, as a sort of domain, because that's completely different, right?
Yeah.
Locked into Newtonian theories of seeing things in a worldview, which just don't mirror actually what developmental models look like. And I think when we start to look at that, I think it opens up a completely different necessity and possibility. And this is where this is the nexus of deep hope that I genuinely think. And I think every crisis is going to be a knocking call for us to sort of imagine differently, imagine differently, imagine differently. It's a knock from the future. It's literally a knock from the future. Come on.
It's so crazy that so much relay. So a while back, I wrote an essay, and I think like 600 people read it, but a few people who read it really thought it was good. It was called Infinitesimal Courage. And the point that I was making was that there's a kind of courage that we're relatively familiar with, which is the courage, say, for example, of the young men charging the beaches at Normandy. But there's another kind of courage, and it's bizarre that the people who are currently being sent into armed conflict in all kinds of places around the world are not going to be solving any real problems by means of their courage, right? It will take courage to do what they're doing, not going to be solving any problems. To solve the problems is going to require that we actually develop infinitesimal courage, and most notably, unfortunately, in those human types who tend not to display precisely that, right? It's the leader of some bureaucracy or some corporation or some government who will actually have to be willing to do something that might fail, which is nowhere near the same as charging a machine gun, and yet the abject cowardice of those individuals is too much on display. But if we could just remember hearing the story of Feynman at in the group that was investigating what went down with the Challenger. And he was the only one who had the ordinary courage to simply ask the hard questions. And if he hadn't been there, we would maybe have never figured out what happened. But because he was there, we found it out. So that's the call, right? The call is to actually go to the people who are in positions of some degree of responsibility, and that's not even say leadership, to have the infinitesimal courage to face the fact that the things that they suspect could be, but are afraid to try, that's where we need to go.
Yeah, and I would totally agree. And I think the second part of that is that at a systemic level, I worry, and you referenced it earlier, that most of what we're living in is zombie, i.e. it is dead already.
Yeah.
The courage to admit that, the courage to admit that if you crystallize the risks of climate change on your balance sheet, you're not standing, you're already dead.
Mm-hmm.
The courage to recognize that. I think there is going to be these courage moments, these moments of infiniteness, courage, because I think only when you do that, only when you embrace those moments, does the Overton window of the possible expand? Do the lock-ins of the present actually become recognizable? Because you're right to say that the risks, we perceive the risk in trying something new, but that's only because we think the present is alive. If we thought the present is already dead, then actually the risk of not doing is much greater, much, much greater. And so the question is, how do we start to shift these vision perspectives? And the other thing I'd say is that I think it goes, we've referenced this before, that I think the problem space is that psychologically and linguistically, we're captured by noun and property thinking, right? So theories of property, which in order for something to be property, it has to be bounded. And in order for something to be property, it has to be enslaved. And in order for something to have property, it has to give me rights. Right? It's asymmetric. It's not rights and responsibilities, it's rights. So, and if we then look at that through labor theory, or if we look at that through any other theory, we see we've constructed a worldview on this deadening, this bounding, this deadening and asymmetric enslavement of things, which if you conceive the world through that, then you're right, we have to pre-kill the world. We have to make it anti-developmental, because property is not developmental. It is object or status, it's asymmetric. So we've been self-indoctrinating ourselves to kill the world, literally and metaphorically, in order for us to have a dead relationship with something, an enslaved relationship with something. And in a sense, we created the world around us. We've also captured ourselves in that model, right? We have enslaved ourselves to theories of labor and unit systems and functional systems. So it's a sort of mutual capture. And that's the kind of bind that we're in, is that we can see it, but actually, as you rightly say, it's closer to reality to see ourselves as developmental. However, the kind of mythos bind that we built is problematic, and breaking that bind is the infinitesimal courage, is the courage of those things, which is extraordinary.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly it. It's I think it all basically rests right there. Like that's the foundation. And I agree that we will be seeing, if this particular event manages not to pull the thread so that everything starts to unravel, it's just a matter of time. And these windows will open. And so, yeah, there's a ground that. Let's call forth that courage. And to the extent that we can, make it easier, like pull that, connect with those things from the future that are knocking, are really saying, hey, this way. Oh, come on, guys, come on, humanity, we've done this. We can do this before. I mean, just think about the times back in history, like the collapse of the Roman Empire and the rise of the West. I mean, the amount of courage that was showing up in the communities that were surviving in that chaos, and they built something. They built something profound. This has happened everywhere, every civilization. When the end of the cycle happens, the beginning of the cycle is also happening, and so we just have to return to that sensibility and reconnect with that, and be willing. I mean, it's such a weird thing to say, but the basic idea of we're going to die, right? You and I are going to die. That should not cause us the least bit of disquiet or fear. Our only challenge is, can we actually live while we're here? That's the hard part. Most of us died a long time ago and have been surviving ever since. The more and more people who are ready, willing, and able to just step into the fact that their death is not relevant, and therefore their reputation is not relevant, but doing what is absolutely right, and they know that it's right, and living in that way, and just stepping directly one step in front of the other on that path of what they know is right. That's what breaks that's what turns the cycle back over.
Yeah, and it's the courage, as you rightly say, to be the heretics of today, right? So when somebody, when they sort of said, right, the sun goes around the earth, to actually we go around the sun, that was a heretical thing, because it shifted our theory of power and decentered humanity from the orbits of the world, right? This was a massive leap in decentering ourselves. And I think there is a need to embrace, and I think this, as you and I have said before, the science and the logics of this are out there. This is no longer a gap of the knowledge.
That's right.
It's a gap of actually us embracing that knowledge, embracing that deep knowledge to find the pathways, which is, I think, the real gap. Which is, I think, the real gap.
Are you okay? It's important that you survive for the next little bit. I was only kidding about where we're gonna. I mean, right now.
Yeah.
Ah,
But it's really important, and I think so. What are the to be able to look through those shatters, to shift, to be the heretics of today, to be the cognizant describers of a reality of tomorrow. That is the courage that's needed. That is the courage that's needed in the everyday. That's the courage to see the world as dead when it could be alive. The courage to actually unleash the full capacity of being human. The courage to see actually machines not through an othered landscape and a kind of sort of an asset theory, but a developmental theory. These are completely different paradigms of civilization. And I think what I find hopeful is that those futures knock at us. They're no longer dreams of science fiction. Actually, they're literally knocking at our windows, inviting us into beings. And that flipping courage, that infinitesimal courage, is actually really critical.
we'll have to keep our eyes open, right, these next few weeks, and our eyes up, right? We need to not be allowing ourselves to be overwhelmed by the noise. There'll be a lot of it. And this is one of those. So what is that? That's a different kind of thing. That's cool head, right?
I think this is a really important conversation, actually, because I do think it's a feeling I've been having as well, which is that in moments where you see these fractures, there's what is the bodily response? What is the invited response? And what is the, and I think this is a real challenge for all of us as we see the horrors unfold in different formats. And how do we preserve our humanity and expand our humanity, not diminish our humanity, not be inflicted by a trauma to actually regress in our care and our love, but to be invited to see through the open window for a radical possibility. There is something about how we be into this moment, how we become into this moment, that I think is a really significant question, because I think the horrors will increase. But if those horrors traumatize us to the point of dehumanizing, and by humanizing I mean breaking our capacity for being our full embodied becoming, then the horrors will win.
That's right. That's right.
Fires. This is the developmental capacity that we have to build to be in this situation, which I think is very difficult and very challenging in itself as well. Very difficult and challenging.
Very difficult. And I think you're right. It actually is probably at the very, very heart. Well, that was a dark laugh. So, and the context we find ourselves in is the inescapable training ground. We are going to be faced with horrors. So do we find ourselves becoming horrible as a consequence? Are we dragged down? And this doesn't mean to become indifferent. That's just the mirror image of the same thing. And if we become enraged, if we become numb, and neither of these, we have to actually grow our heart so that we can continue to fully love, even as the wounds are thrown upon it. Right? That's the developmental center. And so, like it or not, that's the ground we find ourselves in. And if we turn our eyes away from what's happening, we've lost it. We've lost track of what's really happening. And if we join in the chaos, we've lost track of what's really happening.
Maybe, that's I don't believe in this in a sort of belief sense, but when we look at the idea that, say, in 40 years, humanity could unleash infinite energy. Within the next 40 years, it is plausible, if we don't mutually destroy ourselves, we release infinite energy systems relative to our current situation. Thorium reactors, we unlock our whole energy. But in order to make it through to that degree of system level energy abundance, we have to go through these developmental arcs to be able to live, to be able to take constraints to find abundances, to be able to build the psychology, not of individually, but the psychology of abundance of care in the moments of trauma. Maybe these are developmental moments of us as a civilization as well, that actually, if we can deal with this, then we can deal with abundance, because otherwise abundance will be self-terminating in its own way. So
that's right. Yeah, these things are remarkably tightly interwoven. Yeah, the metaphor of the individual who wins the lottery and then destroys themselves is commonplace, right? And this is for sure the case. So if we accidentally find our way surviving until we've created so much capacity that we kill ourselves that way, that's not a really particularly good way of getting there. We need to grow, right? We need to grow into this capacity, because all the good stuff that is happening, there's good stuff happening all over the place. All that good stuff comes with the sharp edge of the blade if we don't grow into it. And so you're quite correct. Like, this is a developmental challenge, and we have to grow up. And if we grow up, it's funny. Yeah, I wrote an essay recently on civium, which I promised myself I wouldn't do, but I couldn't help it. And one of the elements that immediately came open was the movement from an adolescent age to an age of actual maturity. And we have been running an adolescent civilization for a very long time, across all sorts of fields. Even think about the focus of where the mindset is. The virtues are in the 20s to 30s mindset, at best, by the way, and highly underdeveloped 20s and 30s, still living an adolescent mindset. We have to grow up, right? We have to actually become mature as a civilization, or as a world, to be able to handle the things that we can do. And that's just another way of saying we're not like unto gods, therefore we must become one. I'm actually saying something simpler. We just have to grow up.
And in a way, these moments that we're being taught are maybe they are the kind of we talk about the kind of Fermi paradox, but the developmental pathways to addressing the Fermi paradox, right? And the question is, can we learn the lessons fast enough, at scale enough, and speed enough? And
nice.
What does give me hope is that, whether you look at the adoption rate of, say, ChatGPT, or adoption rate of technologies and ideas as a whole, have we built now a possibility path that actually, if new frames of thinking and being erupt, their adoption rate is not going to be 40 years. The adoption rate of those frames is going to be like this, linguistically, language-wise, framing-wise,
totally.
Institutionally. So there is an interesting synchronicitous, sort of capacity that we built, this kind of singularity capacities, that things can go boom. And so we no longer are. And I think things will evolve at rates, because I think, as you rightly said, we've been held back. And as the shackles break, boom, we're going to see these. And I think the crisis moments are going to open up these windows. And it'll take 1, 2, and suddenly we'll start to see effervescence of possibilities erupt. Because, as you rightly say, the moment demands it. And I kind of almost believe that I think moments demand, like the moments construct the genius. The situation invites the genius, because it creates the possibility to see in another way, to be another way, and demands it. And yes, probabilistically, it's going to take 2 or 3 of these things, but that's where my hope becomes. I think it's not going to be the prevention of a great leader standing forward and say, I see the future, and thereby I hereby write the future. I think it will be, we will learn in crisis and transition, and crisis and transition. And if we can maintain not being traumatized and regressive, in our developmental human development pathways and not succumb to anger, not succumb to the vices in the system, that then opens us up. And that is a really powerful invitation right now. And that's not just for humans, it's humans and our institutional machines, right? So our institutional machines are designed for reactive, simplistic, sort of reptilian brain thinking. So that's actually a developmental model that we have to build into our machine systems, analog and non-analog systems as well.
Nice. Yeah, I think that there's the moment just continues to draw nigh. We know it's coming. It's drawing nigh. And I think we ultimately know how to do it. The possibility is very present. And this is not something where hope needs to be even thin. The light is extremely bright, very strong, and right there. It really is a matter of us just kind of staying very clear, very clean, and taking those steps properly.
No, Jordan, one thing I've sort of been like this conversation that you and I have just had, right? One of the things that I find interesting about these conversations, just to sort of play it out, is that this conversation exists at the intersection of multiple knowledge bases, right? And you and I have been both privileged to operate at the intersection of many worlds.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? It's not that, certainly for myself, I wouldn't claim myself as being any genius or anything. It's the privilege of having operated at the intersection of multiple worlds that allows us to see whether it is the learning developmental capacity needs or actually theories of property or theories of moving beyond property to understanding theories of kind of bureaucracy and these intersection problems. And the challenge I think I face, and I think we face collectively, is, and I think people like Peter Thiel sort of brought this up, I think, in different formats, is that actually our societal capacity for intersectional knowledges is actually impaired. So actually very few people are able to operate at the intersection of multiple knowledge bases with sufficient liquidity and lucidity of knowledge to be able to see the possibility space, not to be caught by the dominant theories of capital allocation and the predictive nature of those capabilities through a capital-centric worldview. So you can see a new theory of intersection. And that, I think, is a limiter right now. That I think is a genuine system limiter, is that I think part of these discussions is to build shared literacy, shared comprehension and critique, right? It's not saying what you and I are saying is right. And every part of these conversations, the reason why we even rehearse our conversations that we've had before is because every one of these is a slight nuance shift, slight language shift, slight position shift, continuous iteration of discourse. But there is a really interesting question for me, that the intersectional knowledge problem, because I was at sort of a inner development goals conference that was looking at inner development goals as a relationship to sustainable development goals and talking about development as a counterpoint. And the thing that struck me was the lack of people that operate in the intersectional knowledge. You have a lot of people that talk about the inner development without understanding the technological development capabilities, without understanding actually theories of property and orchestration capacities and bureaucratic systems. And that's a limiter, right? That's a limiter. That's a rate transition limiter right now.
It makes all the sense in the world, of course, because as you say, the capital allocation mechanisms resource only things that are highly legible. And that creates a pathway towards, just think about it just very simply, right? Somewhere at 17, 18, you start getting put from being able to walk around to getting on a train, right? Your ability to move through a space that is an open fluid space is now converted into, this is what you are, right? You're now going into a very specific discipline, and you get to have the ability to access the language of that discipline, the toolkit of that discipline, which I'm sure in the 50s, 60s, and 70s bore a lot of fruit Right? We further disciplines tremendously by means of that technique. By the way, I don't mean specifically in scientific disciplines. We could put literally anything where you get paid to do it, right? That's it. And so to be in this intersectional space is, as you say, very much a privilege. Either you were lucky, you carved something out because you just couldn't get in any box, right? That's pretty much it. I'm sure that's your case as well as mine. Like, I remember very clearly going, look, I can't work for anybody and I can't do anything that bores me. So I'm just going to have to figure out how to carve enough territory that I can run the way that I want to run. Not out of any sense of, how would I say, that being a virtue, but simply recognizing my own vices were going to be terminal in the world that I was being offered. And so, yeah, it's you get extinguished if you try to actually build this competence in the world that we're in. And it's a rare bird that's actually found some of that capacity. And so therefore, that's the thing that needs to be spread, right? More of that capacity. Now that we've, how do you say, now that we've reached the end of the mining reign, right? Now that the seam has been tapped in the disciplinary vector, and the second and third derivative of declining returns is well in our rearview mirror. Think about just physics, right? The story of how little has actually happened in physics now for a generation, 2 generations, such a burst of activity in the first part of the 20th century, and then now nothing. This is true everywhere. And so the point is to say, hey, the sweetness is in this new location. And right now you can't get paid very well for it, but it is actually where the sweetness is. And the good news is it's actually where the things that all the treasures that we actually are looking for are found in that location. So much power can come when you get 2 of these 3 things and you begin to learn how to do the abstractions and being able to actually see the patterns that are mechanism independent. Notice how you can rotate something and go, oh, wow, this was developed in economics, but look what happens if you flip it over here and put it into ecology, or vice versa, and bringing them into relationship.
Exactly. And I think, maybe also these moments are periodic, right? So you go through these, what I call intersectional moments, to see a new theory of disciplines. And then actually that disciplines becomes the new norm. And then those new norms break because they can't deal with reality as it's confounding itself. So these are maybe systems, right? Cyclical sort of models. But what seems clear is that we are in this moment of intersectional knowledge bases. And I think the key rate limiter right now, and I think this is a real transition rate limiter, is this intersectional knowledge base problem. Because I think it's not knowledge as in, it's not just a sort of like a language knowledge, it's a craft knowledge problem. It's like it's an embodied knowledge problem. You've worked at the intersection of technology, you worked at the intersection of all sorts of other capabilities, political referencing and advice to governments. That gives you a type of intersectional knowledge, not as just a descriptive knowledge, but a craft tactical knowledge. And this requires and it also requires a philosophical scaffolding to craft knowledge. It kind of, to use Polini, it's a moment of philosopher makers, philosopher craftspeople. And that actually is at the intersectional quality. So it's also a new way of operationalizing knowledge as well as
It's an interesting point, because the likelihood is that will actually continue to multiply. If we make it through this moment, because each of the individual agents are going to simultaneously become richer and become focused on the developmental, the field of what is happening will actually expand on orders of magnitude. And so any given particular encounter will actually be an encounter of, you will need to have a robust capacity to have highly rapid absorption of embodied learning. It would be a requisite necessity. The expertise will be absurd. You'll have to actually have a completely different character, being able to enter into novelty, into a new environment, and be comfortable with it so that you can just grow into it, because literally every encounter you have will be of that sort.
That's a powerful invitation to all of humanity, right? That's not a theory of labor, right? That's not it's not, and we talked about this last time, it's not a freedom of choice or a freedom of consumption. It's a freedom to be radically human, and to kind of the freedom to be human is what this landscape is offering, because it's actually an embodied theory of learning, a developmental theory of being human. It's a sort of a relational idea of of existence, because actually it's recognizing, as you rightly said, this conversation is not a thermodynamic net zero sum conversation, right? It's not the loss of energy, it's a developmental. You and I talking has built both of our capabilities simultaneously. It's a completely different theory. And I think that is an extraordinary invitation. And I think we have to root this conversation in that extraordinary capacity, because I think every one of these revolutions is rooted in reimagination of reimagining what it means to be human. And I think we are regressively caught in kind of economic theory, labor theory of humanness, which I think has been deep. That is what I would say is the endemic drag back into the 19th century. Unless we control that, and our politicians and our leaders can understand a new theory of being human, and I would invite everyone who listens to this podcast, just listen to politicians talk about population basis, employment figures, unemployment figures. It's a very reductive thesis of a population. It's the instrumental function of a population. And imagine a whole new characteristic of describing what it means to be part of a civilization. And I think this is the capture point that you talked about, in my view, Jordan, like this regressive capture point, which is actually holding us back into 19th century kind of labor instrumentalization of being human. And I think until we break that and we can open up new language, I think we're captured.
So the thing I would put out there as the kind of last thing for me is just to simplify for people. If you happen to be in a position of responsibility, which is to say sometimes a position of authority, and I want to make it very clear, if you think you're in a position of authority, you're really in a position of responsibility. If you happen to be in a position of responsibility, infinitesimal courage. That's the provocation. But everybody's in some position of responsibility. And the invitation at the bottom is to enter into those relationships of care, right? And to reconnect with the richness, even just the sacredness of the things with which you are in relationship. The people around you, the land around you, the objects around you, just reconnect with that and begin to propagate that as a language, as an aesthetic, right? An aesthetic of taking reality as sacred, as a fundamental assumption, yourself and everything around you. And as that field effect begins to spread, I think our people in positions of authority will at least begin to have some notion of what it might be like for them to actually step through that portal into courage.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've said it eloquently. I mean, the only thing I'd add to it is that affect not only yourself, but the rule systems that you are operating. Because actually, so much of our world is not constructed by humans, but our rule systems. And we ourselves are instrumentalized in those rule systems. So think carefully about that employment contract you hand out. Think carefully about the contract that you sign.
Yeah.
Think carefully about the rights to property. What does it really mean? Think carefully when you buy something. Are you buying something? Are you extracting it? Are you in care with it? Think carefully of all those relationships and softly allow yourself to recode them. So not only for ourselves, but in our relationship to the world around us. I think it's very eloquently said, Jordan. I think that's a really great way to maybe wrap up today.
And you can get some sleep. It's late over there.
Yeah. But I think this has been a complete conversation, which I've enjoyed. It's another arc. And I think what I enjoy about these conversations, and I hope, everyone that joins in, it's like drawing the circle again and again. It's okay. And I think every time we draw it, it gets a little nuance better. And and context situations inform the circle. Let's keep drawing.
Beautiful. All right. We'll look forward to the next time.
Thank you, my friend.
Bye-bye.